To understand why an Asian NATO might need to be formed, we have to look at the geopolitical security situation in Asia, and that means touching on Asia's most powerful country by far, which is of course China. So first, let's talk about China's economic rise. China started out as a poor country. It might be hard to believe today with all the skyscrapers and big cities, but back in 1960, it had a pretty small economy. Things started to pick up bit by bit, but notice growth really took off after the year 2001? Why is that? Well, the answer is simple. Because in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, or WTO. The WTO is the body that regulates global trade. Joining it gave China much greater access to the world's richest markets, including the United States, and it used that access to export to wealthy markets and got very rich as a result. Now you might be wondering, why would the US allow an authoritarian regime like China so much access to its market? Well, there were many reasons, but perhaps the most important one was that many people thought opening up to the Chinese market and allowing China access to the global market would ultimately turn China into a democracy. You can hear that sentiment in Bill Clinton's words, who was president at the time, when he said, quote, "Membership in the WTO, of course, will not create a free society in China overnight, or guarantee that China will play by global rules. But over time, I believe it will move China faster and further in the right direction, and certainly will do that more than rejection would." Now you might want to grab a piece of paper to jot down notes as I explain how that worked. Go ahead. I'll wait. Okay, ready? The genius of how that worked is that it did not work. But until it didn't, the world was flooded with cheap Chinese goods, everything from electronics to utensils to cars, to that new iPhone you tackled Tim Cook for, even though it looks just like the last one. So much of everything today is made in China. China has become the world's factory, the second largest economy, the largest exporter, and second largest importer globally. All these massive changes have given China immense influence over the global economy, even more so in its own neighborhood in Asia. In fact, China now accounts for almost half of Asia's GDP. Part 2. Now let's talk about China's military rise. China's military was once pretty backward. Back in the day, they had to use advanced techniques like human wave attack. Those quickly became zombie wave attacks when their soldiers were cut down, though. Point is, they didn't have much else to rely on. But all that's changed now that their economic heft has given them enough cash to spend on new toys like fighter jets, aircraft carriers, and advanced missile systems. In fact, China is now the second largest defense spender in the world. Yup, China's military is all grown up. And the nations in the Asia-Pacific are feeling the heat. Just consider the infamous South China Sea dispute, which is stirring up a ton of trouble in the Indo-Pacific region. It's a complex issue, but the gist of it is that several nations in the region claim pieces of the South China Sea. But China claims almost all of it, which has put it at odds with other nations that have interest in the South China Sea. It's like when that neighbor of yours who was poor because he fell on hard times suddenly became a billionaire and started buying shotguns, machine guns, a tank, fighter jets, the usual. And then he starts talking about how your yard is really his yard and you should share all the oil you have bubbling beneath your garden. Of course, you'd be nervous. And so, many Asian nations are looking for a powerful ally to help counter China. And that means the United States. You see, no Indo-Pacific country by itself can match China. Let's take the US's treaty allies, for example, and compare them to China. The US has defense treaties with several countries in the Indo-Pacific, including Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, the Philippines, and New Zealand. So how does it look if we put all those countries together and compare them to China? Not good. Combined, they have a much smaller economy, population, defense spending, and industrial capacity. The latter is especially important because it gives you an idea of just how much weapons the countries could manufacture if war broke out. Turns out China would likely dwarf their output. So, by themselves, they are completely overmatched by China. But things change when you add in US support. The total GDP of the US plus its Indo-Pacific allies is roughly double China's. China still wins on population, but the US brings the total of the allies up to almost half of China's population. and total defense spending of the Allied side amounts to over 3 times China's current defense spending. Plus, with the US, Allied industrial capacity almost matches China's. So overall, the Allied side pulls ahead. Hopefully this gives you an idea of why an Asian or Indo-Pacific NATO might make sense. By banding together with the US, Indo-Pacific countries can hope to beat China in the ensuing era of competition, whereas, on their own, they have, in a sense, already lost. But to understand how an Asian NATO might function, let's take a look at the actual NATO. That requires a quick recap of World War II, of course. We won. That's it. So who's the we? Well, the Allies, the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union were the 3 most important to fight against Germany. It's often said that the war in Europe was won with American capital, meaning machinery, money, and so on, British intelligence, and Soviet manpower. So you would think after cooperating together in one of the most titanic struggles in history to defeat such a terrible foe, the Allies would live happily ever after, work together, have fun. Wrong. Shortly after the war, the Soviets and the Allies turned against each other. Because the Soviet army was so huge, it was obvious that if they launched an invasion of Western Europe, they'd have the upper hand in a conventional fight. So the Western Europeans were in desperate need of protection. That's why NATO was formed, to provide collective defense. No individual European country could stand against the Soviets on its own, but standing together, under the umbrella of the US military, they could hold their own. The purpose of NATO is perhaps best fleshed out in its famous 5th article, which declares that an attack on any member is an attack on all. And then, in a mealy-mouthed way, it basically says they'll act together in defense of that nation. But there's a catch. The NATO treaty is geographically limited to, you'll never guess it, the North Atlantic region. So the treaty only comes into force if an attack occurs against a nation within the North Atlantic region that's a member of NATO. In other words, if the US state of Hawaii was attacked, the NATO treaty would not apply because Hawaii is in the Pacific, not the North Atlantic. The US would be on its own, and the same applies to the territories of other NATO nations outside of the North Atlantic. So that means the US can't count on NATO to help it fight any conflict in Asia or the Indo-Pacific, at least not legally. The US would have to rely on itself and its Indo-Pacific allies, perhaps. Of course, the US doesn't need any help to defend itself, because it's so powerful. But it wouldn't hurt. And luckily for the US, it can call on several Indo-Pacific allies to help defend it. But what if one of the US's allies in Asia were attacked? Could they legally depend on all the US's Asian allies to defend them? No, they can't. Because unlike the US-backed NATO alliance system in Europe, the US alliance system in the Indo-Pacific is not multilateral or collective, so everyone does not have to respond when one is attacked. It's a hub-and-spoke model type of alliance system, where the US sits at the center, having bilateral defense treaties with different nations. So, for example, the US has a defense treaty with South Korea. So if South Korea is attacked, it can invoke that treaty and the US would be legally obligated to help defend it. But South Korea could not invoke an equivalent of NATO's Article 5 to call on all US allies in the Indo-Pacific to defend it. That's why the case for an Asian equivalent of NATO is so obvious. By pooling their resources under American leadership, US allies in Asia would be in a much stronger, safer position than they are in now. The formation of an Asian NATO would be a major development in the ensuing competition between the US and China. And China would not be fond of it, of course. And it's definitely interesting to consider what its response might look like. Would it create its own alliance system? What would that look like? I'll return to that question in a future video. But till then, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe for more. And as always, take care.